Blacula. One of my favorite vampire films and one of my favorite blaxploitation films. Blacula was released in 1972, and people that know vampire films know Blacula, and people that know blaxploitation films know Blacula. It is a fairly well-known film that was successful in the box office. You may have been surprised to see it here on the list because you were unfamiliar with Blacula, but I think everyone should see Blacula at least once in their lives. Blacula is part of a genre of film we call blaxploitation films. Blaxploitation films started in the 1970s. They were a take on what we often refer to as exploitation films or grindhouse films. There's actually an interesting documentary that's worth watching called American Grindhouse that talks about the history of exploitation films, which had half-naked women running through them, were really violent, had kind of bizarre plots. Blaxploitation films were a take on exploitation films in that they starred black actors. They were still made by many white directors, but they followed some of the same trends as exploitation films. The first two major blaxploitation films are commonly thought to be Shaft and Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. Both came out in 1971. You might be more familiar with Shaft than you are with Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song starred and directed by Melvin Van Peebles. Mario Van Peebles' father, if you're familiar with Mario Van Peebles, he starred in New Jack City. It's a tough film to watch. Shaft is a pretty straightforward film. Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song is difficult to watch for a lot of reasons. The narrative is hard to follow. The production is pretty bad. And it actually begins with a young boy having sex with a grown woman. And that young boy is Mario Van Peebles. His father was nice enough to cast him in that role. So that scene alone makes it difficult to watch. But the whole film in general is kind of tough to get through. If you want to study blaxploitation films, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song is an important film to watch. If you're not studying blaxploitation films and you're just interested in them, I'd probably start with Shaft and skip over Sweet Sweetback unless you have a high tolerance for a lot of things that are featured in Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. In 2000, Shaft was remade, starring Samuel L. Jackson as Shaft, Christian Bale as the villain, directed by John Singleton of Boys in the Hood fame. The remake of Shaft is pretty bad. It was hard to watch. The acting was pretty lame. I actually saw Shaft as part of a promotion that Blockbuster was having, if you remember Blockbuster Video, the stores. They had a 30 DVDs for 30 days promotion for $30. So you give Blockbuster $30, and every day for 30 days you had to come in and pick up a DVD. You didn't have to watch each one every day, but you had to pick up one every day. And if you missed a day, you didn't get credit for that day. I think I ended up picking up 29 movies, Shaft being one of them. Really wasn't worth my time back then, and probably isn't worth your time now if you haven't seen it already. It's not particularly well done. Badass is a biopic directed by Mario Van Peebles about his father and about the making of Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. That actually is worth watching. It's a very good movie. It's his tribute. It really is well done and is definitely worth your time, and it won several Sundance accolades. So Prince talks about blaxploitation films in chapter 11, and it's important to think of Blacula again, like a lot of the other stuff that we're doing in this course. The vampire film Blacula is the example, but there's a larger part of film history to keep in mind. We want to think about Blacula in terms of blaxploitation films and vampire films. So blaxploitation films, again, began in the early 1970s, 1971 to be precise. They starred black heroes. They were action-oriented. They had a lot of sex, a lot of violence. Primarily made by white directors, primarily produced by white producers, primarily directed at black audiences. They were pretty controversial. They had a lot of racial stereotypes. You could see Blacula had quite a few racial stereotypes as well as stereotypes of gay men. The genre kind of burned itself out pretty quickly. So most genres, types of films, what we call types of films genres, do eventually kind of collapse in on themselves, but not as quickly as blaxploitation films did. So if they started in 1971, by the time you get to like 1973, 1974, 1975, they're kind of a joke. And that's uncommon for a group of films to become that kind of silly and outlandish so quickly. So some of the more famous early blaxploitation films include Superfly, Slaughter, starring Jim Brown, former football player, Fred Williamson. Keep in mind, don't forget Fred Williamson's face. We will see him again. Black Caesar, Coffee, Cleopatra Jones, Foxy Brown. You may have heard of some of these. The Mac, Black Gun. By the mid 1970s, blaxploitation films had become parodies. So there was a whole series of blaxploitation films by someone named Rudy Ray Moore, of Dolomite fame, Human Tornado, P.D. Wheatstraw, Disco Godfather. If you've seen any of Rudy Ray Moore's films, they're not particularly good films. They're entertaining to watch, but they're kind of, Plan 9 from Outer Space entertaining. They're really not entertaining because they're well done. There was one called Dr. Black and Mr. Hyde, another one starring Jim Brown. So a whole series of movies that were, at this point, not really well done and kind of almost parodies unintentionally. I include Car Wash in this list because it was a different kind of blaxploitation film. I actually find Car Wash to be a very good movie and very entertaining. But relative to movies like Superfly and Black Caesar, Car Wash really is not in the same category of blaxploitation films. There have been a few blaxploitation films that we would consider to be more modern blaxploitation films, and these are all worthwhile, certainly worth watching. You might be familiar with I'm Gonna Get You Sucker, Pootie Tang, very well done movie. Undercover Brother, I thought really was kind of funny. There's a movie that was a Comedy Central movie called The Hebrew Hammer, starring Mario Van Peebles, among others. And what's funny about The Hebrew Hammer, it's kind of it's blaxploitation with a Jewish take on it, if you will. And the movie is especially funny if you know two things: if you know the history of blaxploitation films, and if you understand the history of kind of Jewish humor and Yiddish jokes. So it's very funny for particular audiences. I think it's certainly worth watching, and you can get that on DVD. Black Dynamite was a kind of blaxploitation parody film that was made. I enjoyed. And then Jackie Brown was Quentin Tarantino's homage to the blaxploitation film, starring Pam Grier of blaxploitation fame. Quentin Tarantino loves blaxploitation films, and this film is a good example of his love for the blaxploitation genre. Again, a very good movie. There was a movie called Machete. So Machete's history is kind of interesting. Machete was a fake commercial between the two major features of Grindhouse. So Grindhouse was this really long Robert Rodriguez, Quentin Tarantino collaboration. It was really two movies in one. So if you saw them both in the theaters, and I did, it was about like 3.5 hours for the whole thing. In between the two major features were some commercials. They were fake commercials, and one of those fake commercials was for a movie called Machete. Some people consider Machete to be mexploitation. They actually turned it and made it into a real movie. So it was a feature-length movie. It is relatively entertaining. If mexploitation was a genre, it was burned out immediately when Machete Kills came out, which is really quite awful. So they should have just left it alone at Machete. But Machete Kills is definitely not worth watching. As we talk about sequels, and as we've talked about them before, there was a sequel to Blacula. Hard to believe given what happens to Blacula at the end of the movie, but Blacula is brought back in Scream, Blacula Scream. Again, this is 1973. The genre has already become kind of a joke. So they brought Blacula back with voodoo, and that's how he survives into the sequel. Again, absolutely awful. It made the first Blacula, look like an Oscar-winning film. So blaxploitation generally, and Blacula in particular, are known for stereotypical depictions that have to do with race, sexuality, gender, and you can see that these two characters, the two characters that are going antiquing at the beginning of the movie, are really stereotypes of gay men, and the film is not at all bashful about playing into stereotypes of a variety of kinds. Blacula begins with what we would call an establishing shot. So anytime there's a shot, it's certainly in the beginning of a movie, but you can have them throughout the movies that tell you where and when you are. We call those establishing shots. You don't even really have to have Transylvania 1780 Castle Dracula to be an establishing shot, but this really drives it home that it's an establishing shot. You know you're in Transylvania, it's 1780, this is Dracula's castle, and it's all done with a single image. So there are other elements of the vampire film in Blacula. So you can see there is a Dracula, not a particularly fearsome or well done Dracula, but he's there. In this particular film, he happens to be white. In a lot of blaxploitation films, the villains are white. White people play really two kinds of roles in blaxploitation films. They're either the villain or they are the inept authority figures, usually police officers. And Blacula has both of those. Here you see the iconic vampire in the coffin shot. We've seen this in Nosferatu. We've seen it in Dracula. We've seen it a number of times, and here it is yet again. Except in this case, it happens to be Blacula in the coffin and not Dracula. We have the instance where someone takes a picture of Blacula and he doesn't appear in the picture. That is like not casting a reflection. So that is another theme that pops up in vampire films, and Blacula makes that connection for us. You see the cross as a weapon. So again, that will happen again and again in our films, and Blacula is no exception to that. And then we see Blacula hurt by sunlight. In fact, he dies by sunlight. And we can trace that all the way back to Nosferatu in terms of its appearance in film. We see very, very early in the movie that Blacula becomes a blaxploitation film. So the kind of fight scene set to music in the very beginning of Blacula is very blaxploitation. The blaxploitation hero is constantly getting in these fist fights with large groups of people, many of them white people. But this is a telltale sign that you're in a blaxploitation film, and really unlike our other vampire films, this doesn't really happen again. Where Blacula has to have a fist fight with 10 people, or Dracula, or whoever our vampire is. So this is because really it's a blaxploitation film. We do have a moment that harkens back to our previous vampire narrative. So you see a character cuts himself, like Hutter in Renfield, and the coffin is nearby, and that kind of awakens the vampire. So that is an unintentional connection to other vampire films. So that's worth noting. We have a stand-in for Van Helsing in this film. So we don't have an actual Van Helsing. No one calls him Van Helsing. And we were used to seeing Van Helsing or a Van Helsing-like character, a doctor of some sort. But really in this film, Dr. Thomas is the Dr. Van Helsing of the movie. The investigator, the skeptic, the one who eventually chases down Dracula and leads to Dracula's death. In this case, Blacula's death. We have that kind of standard vampire entrance. I always enjoy when somebody who's clearly out of place as Blacula is here with his cape looking very vampire-like, just kind of rolling into the club to hang out, listen to some music, have some champagne, and really only one character says, a cape, really, in the club? But by and large, the vampire makes his entrance, and it's significant to the audience, but the characters in the film just kind of roll with it. And we've seen that with Dracula, and we'll see it again and again. So Blacula and blaxploitation films generally are very, very tied to the music that appears in them. So you had the privilege of seeing and hearing this band for significant portions of time. The first song they sing seems to last forever. It is like a 10-minute song, and it just keeps going. And if you If you ever go back and watch Blacula again, you'll see the number of times that it almost seems like this song is over and then it keeps going. I actually enjoy it, but it is kind of funny. This was a real band. They were called the Hughes Corporation. They obviously didn't have much of a career because nobody knows about them anymore, but some audiences would have recognized the Hughes Corporation in Blacula. The type of music that the Hughes Corporation represents in these scenes is something that we call diegetic music. So the diegesis is the story when we're talking about film. Diegetic music is music that is heard by the characters. It is part of the narrative. It is part of the film. It is acknowledged as something that is going on while the film is taking place. Non-diegetic music is really music only the audience hears. The characters in the movie don't hear non-diegetic music. And that's really what these scenes represent, diegetic music. So for the article that we read by Lawrence, Lawrence gives us a little bit of history on blaxploitation films, and those details are important to know. There was a critical negative reaction to blaxploitation films. They had a lot of sex, a lot of violence, drug use. If you've seen the movie Superfly, the main character Prentice, Superfly is not his name. His name is Prentice, is a drug dealer. It's a movie that resolution is found when he threatens to kill someone and his family, a kind of corrupt authority figure, a drug dealer threatening to kill someone and his family, and that's your hero. So some people were not real excited about the depiction of African American characters as drug dealers, thugs, gangsters. As vampires go, Blacula's kind of sympathetic. He's not a vampire that is all bad. I mean, he's still a vampire. He still kills people. He still kills innocent people. But ultimately, as vampires go, he wasn't the worst of our vampires. Blacula, the film, takes place in what Lawrence describes as a black urban setting. You can see the club, the city, various other locations, and it has an R&B soundtrack. And I would argue that's primarily because it's a blaxploitation film. For the first time, we witness how the vampire is created. So Blacula wasn't a vampire at the start of the movie and becomes a vampire when Dracula makes him a vampire. And that's kind of interesting. We don't see that many times in the films that we will watch for this course. There was a pretty integrated marketing campaign for Blacula, and part of the way in which this film was marketed was alluding to the theme of slavery. And that is actually part of the narrative, the beginning. Blacula is asking Dracula to stop the slave trade, and that's why Dracula kills him. So there was an intentional marketing campaign around the theme of slavery relative to Blacula. Critics weren't as excited about Blacula as the box office was, audiences. It was a really successful film. Some critics liked it, some critics did not, but ultimately it was a box office hit. So you might have been a little taken by the production value of Blacula, and when we say production value, it's really kind of the quality of the film that they made. And this isn't a particularly high quality film, and in a lot of ways. So this scene, I did not crop this. This is an actual screenshot that's completely gratuitous and unnecessary. And there are several of those. I just picked one. But these kind of shots of women's bodies with their heads kind of missing are really objectifying, not particularly progressive approaches to filmmaking. I do enjoy that the coroner, Sam, has a hook for a hand for no apparent reason on an arm that's probably a good 25% longer than it needs to be. So this actor was not missing a hand. They just decided it would be a good narrative technique to have a hook for a hand. And I think that's kind of funny, and I laugh every time I see Sam's hook for a hand, which is never even discussed in the movie. He's just kind of walking around with a hook. If you look closely in this shot, the police officer has one eye closed and one eye open, probably to help him focus on the shot that he's taking. that ends up hitting an innocent person. But because of the kind of low production values of Blacula, the shadow actually obscures the eye that's open. So it looks like he's shooting with his eyes closed, which is all the more reason why he would shoot an innocent person. And it, again, incompetent white authority figure shooting with his eyes closed. The club scenes, if you pay attention to what's going on in them, they can be kind of entertaining. I love this guy. We see him only for a second. That is my favorite outfit in all of Blacula. If I could pull that outfit off, I would wear it myself. And then, of course, when Blacula dies in the end and is destroyed by the sunlight, you can see the very, very high production value in the special effects of what is clearly wax or plastic. Just not, barely an attempt to show a decomposing head. So I enjoy that element of production value as well. So what are the key takeaways of Blacula? So Blacula is both a vampire film and a blaxploitation film. Blacula follows the vampire tradition, but differs in some important ways that we've discussed. Blaxploitation, the blaxploitation era in film is important to understand as a part of film history, but it was a very short part of film history and only pops up intermittently these days, very rarely. Blacula utilized a sex and violence narrative as well as stereotypes that really ties it to the blaxploitation era, and it makes it different than typical vampire films that don't include those kinds of narrative techniques, but makes the film, this particular film, pretty entertaining.